The coffin was sealed, but not before he slipped it inside. A small camera, hidden in the corner where the satin lining met the wood. It was a desperate move, one that made his hands shake as he adjusted the lens. The cemetery workers had already left, and the area was silent except for the rustling of leaves in the cold evening breeze. He stood there staring at the closed casket, his heart pounding like a drum. This was his last chance to find out what really happened to Princess. Princess, his 12-year-old daughter, his world. She had been full of life, always laughing, always running around with her friends. But now she was gone. The official report said it was an accident, a tragic fall from the old bridge near their home. But he couldn't accept it. Something felt wrong. The way the police had rushed the investigation, the way the cemetery staff had pushed for a quick burial. It didn't sit right with him. He had tried to get answers, but every door was slammed in his face. The police told him to move on. The cemetery director gave him a cold, rehearsed speech about closure. Even his own family thought he was losing his mind, but he couldn't let it go. Not when his little girl was lying in that coffin, her life cut short. So he did the unthinkable. He bought a hidden camera, small enough to fit in the palm of his hand, and waited for the right moment. When the cemetery was empty and the workers had left for the day, he snuck back in. He knew it was risky, but he didn't care. He had to know the truth. Now, as he stood in the quiet cemetery, the rows of gravestones casting long shadows in the fading light, he felt a mix of fear and determination. What if he was wrong? What if it really was just an accident? But deep down he knew. Something had happened to Princess, something dark and hidden, and he was going to find out what it was. He took one last look at the coffin, his heart heavy with grief and anger. Then he turned and walked away, leaving the camera to do its work. The next 24 hours would change everything. The next morning he woke up before the sun had even risen. His sleep had been restless, filled with nightmares of Princess calling out to him, her voice echoing in the darkness. He grabbed his laptop and rushed to the cemetery, his heart racing with anticipation. The camera had been recording all night, and he couldn't wait any longer to see what it had captured. When he arrived, the cemetery was still empty, the morning mist hanging low over the gravestones. He quickly located the coffin, which was still undisturbed, and carefully retrieved the camera. His hands trembled as he plugged it into his laptop and opened the video file. At first, the footage was just darkness. The camera had been placed inside the coffin after all. But then he heard it, a faint sound, like someone whispering. He turned up the volume, his breath catching in his throat. The whispers grew louder, and then he saw it, a flicker of light. Someone had opened the coffin. His heart pounded as he watched the footage. A figure appeared, their face obscured by the darkness. They were holding something, a small tool, maybe a screwdriver. The figure began to tamper with the coffin, prying at the edges as if searching for something. He leaned closer to the screen, his eyes wide with shock. What were they looking for? And why? The figure suddenly stopped, as if they had heard something. They quickly closed the coffin and disappeared from view. The footage returned to darkness, but the whispers lingered for a few more seconds before fading away. He sat back, his mind racing. This was proof. Someone had tampered with Princess's coffin. But who? And why? He replayed the footage, trying to make out any details, but the figure remained a shadowy mystery. All he knew was that this wasn't an accident. Someone had been involved in his daughter's death, and they were trying to cover it up. He clenched his fists, his grief now mixed with a burning anger. He would find out who did this. He would make them pay. But first, he needed more evidence. The camera had given him the first clue, but it wasn't enough. He had to dig deeper. With the footage saved on his laptop, he knew he had to act fast. The cemetery was no longer safe. Whoever had tampered with the coffin could return at any moment. He needed answers, and there was only one person who might have them: the funeral director. The funeral home was a small, somber building on the edge of town. He had been there only once before, to make arrangements for Princess's burial. The memory of that day still haunted him. The cold, emotionless tone of the director, the way he had rushed through the paperwork as if it were just another business transaction. At the time, he had been too consumed by grief to notice how strange it all was, but now he saw it clearly. The director had been hiding something. He walked into the funeral home, his laptop tucked under his arm. The director was sitting at his desk, flipping through a stack of papers. He looked up, his expression shifting from surprise to annoyance when he saw who it was. "Can I help you?" the director asked, his voice clipped. "I need to talk to you," he said, his tone firm, "about my daughter." The director sighed as if this were an inconvenience. "I'm sorry for your loss, but there's nothing more I can do. The arrangements have been made, and I know someone tampered with her coffin," he interrupted, slamming his laptop on the desk. "I have proof." The director's face went pale. He glanced at the laptop, then back at him, his eyes narrowing. "What are you talking about?" He opened the laptop and played the footage. The director watched in silence, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. When the video ended, he leaned back in his chair, his face unreadable. "This doesn't prove anything," the director said finally. "It could be anyone. A prank, maybe. You're grieving, and I understand that, but you need to let this go." "Let it go!" he snapped, his anger boiling over. "My daughter is dead, and someone is trying to cover it up. I'm not going to let it go until I find out who did this." The director stood up, his expression hardening. "I think you should leave. If you continue to make accusations, I'll have no choice but to involve the authorities." He stared at the director, his mind racing. There was something in the man's eyes, a flicker of fear, maybe even guilt. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he knew one thing for sure. The director was hiding something. "This isn't over," he said, closing his laptop and heading for the door. "I'm going to find out the truth, no matter what it takes." As he walked out of the funeral home, he felt a surge of determination. The director's reaction had only confirmed his suspicions. He was getting closer to the truth, and he wouldn't stop until he had it. Leaving the funeral home, he felt a mix of frustration and determination. The director's cold dismissal only fueled his resolve. He needed more evidence, something concrete that would expose the truth. But where could he find it? The funeral home was off limits now, and the cemetery was too risky. Then it hit him, the director's office. He had noticed something during his visit, a filing cabinet in the corner of the office, partially hidden behind a curtain. The director had glanced at it nervously when he mentioned the footage. What was in there? He had to find out. That night, he returned to the funeral home. The building was dark, the windows reflecting the pale glow of the streetlights. He moved quickly, staying in the shadows as he approached the back door. It was locked, but he had come prepared. With a small tool, he picked the lock and slipped inside. The funeral home was eerily quiet, the air heavy with the scent of flowers and chemicals. He made his way to the director's office, his heart pounding with every step. The filing cabinet was still there, just as he remembered. He pulled out his flashlight and began to search through the files. Most of the documents were routine: contracts, invoices, burial records. But then he found it, a folder labeled Confidential. His hands trembled as he opened it. Inside were photographs, receipts, and handwritten notes. He flipped through the pages, his eyes widening as he realized what he was looking at. The folder contained evidence of illegal activities, bribes, forged documents, and even records of bodies being moved without proper authorization. Among the papers was a receipt for a large sum of money, dated just days before Princess's death. The name on the receipt was unfamiliar, but the amount was staggering. What was this money for? And who was behind it? He took out his phone and began snapping pictures of the documents. He didn't have time to read everything now, but he knew this was the breakthrough he needed. The director wasn't just hiding something, he was involved in something much bigger. As he was about to leave, he heard a noise outside the office. He froze, his flashlight flickering off. Footsteps echoed in the hallway, growing closer. He held his breath, his mind racing. If he was caught, everything would be over. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. He could hear someone fumbling with the lock. He had to act fast. He grabbed the folder and stuffed it into his jacket, then ducked behind the desk just as the door creaked open. The director walked in, his face illuminated by the glow of his phone. He muttered something under his breath as he crossed the room and opened a drawer. He seemed distracted, as if he hadn't noticed anything out of place. After a moment, he took something from the drawer and left, locking the door behind him. He waited until the footsteps faded before standing up. His heart was still racing, but he couldn't help feeling a sense of triumph. He had the evidence. Now he just had to figure out what it all meant. Back at his home, he spread the documents across the kitchen table. The dim light of a single bulb cast long shadows as he pored over the papers, trying to make sense of the tangled web of corruption he had uncovered. The receipts, the photographs, the notes, they all pointed to something far bigger than he had imagined. The most damning piece of evidence was a series of emails printed on faded paper. They were between the funeral director and a man named Victor Kane. The name sent a chill down his spine. Victor Kane was a well-known businessman in town, someone with connections and power. But what did he have to do with Princess? The emails were cryptic, filled with coded language and vague references. But one phrase stood out. The shipment must go through without delay. Shipment? What were they shipping? And then it hit him. Bodies. They were moving bodies illegally. But why? And how did Princess fit into all of this? He flipped through the photographs next. They were grainy, taken in low light, but he could make out the shapes of coffins being loaded into unmarked vans. One photo showed a group of men in dark clothing, their faces obscured. Another showed a warehouse on the outskirts of town, its windows boarded up. He recognized the place. It had been abandoned for years. His hands shook as he picked up the final document. A list of names. At the top was Princess's name, followed by dates and numbers. His stomach churned as he realized what it was. A ledger. They were keeping track of the bodies, as if they were nothing more than inventory. He leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. This wasn't just about Princess anymore. This was a full-blown conspiracy involving powerful people who would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. He had stumbled into something far more dangerous than he had anticipated, but he couldn't stop now. Princess deserved justice, and he was the only one who could give it to her. He grabbed his phone and began typing a message to his brother, Mark, who worked as a journalist. If anyone could help him expose this, it was Mark. "I need your help," he wrote. "It's about Princess. I found something big, but I can't do this alone. Meet me tomorrow. Don't tell anyone." He hit send and stared at the screen, waiting for a response. A few minutes later, his phone buzzed. "I'll be there," Mark replied. "Be careful." He put the phone down and looked at the documents again. The weight of what he had discovered pressed down on him, but he refused to let it crush him. He had come too far to turn back now. The next morning, he met Mark at a small, secluded park on the edge of town. The air was crisp, and the sound of birds chirping filled the silence between them. Mark was already there, sitting on a bench with a coffee in hand. His face was serious, his usual cheerful demeanor replaced by concern. "You look terrible," Mark said as he approached. "What's going on? Your message sounded urgent." He sat down beside his brother and handed him a folder. "I found this in the funeral director's office last night. It's about Princess." Mark opened the folder and began flipping through the documents. His expression grew darker with each page. "This is insane. Are you sure this is real?" "I saw it with my own eyes," he said, his voice low. "Someone tampered with her coffin, Mark, and now I know why. They're moving bodies, illegally. Princess was just part of their business." Mark leaned back, running a hand through his hair. "This is bigger than I thought. Victor Kane, he's untouchable. If he's involved, this goes deep." "I know," he said, "but I can't let this go. Not after what they did to her." Mark nodded, his jaw tightening. "All right, I'll help you. But we need to be smart about this. If we go public too soon, they'll bury us, literally. We need more evidence. Something that ties Kane directly to Princess." "What do you suggest?" he asked. Mark thought for a moment. "There's a reporter I know, Sandra. She's been investigating Kane for years. If anyone can help us connect the dots, it's her. But we have to be careful. If Kane finds out we're on to him, we're dead." He nodded, feeling a glimmer of hope for the first time in weeks. "Let's do it." With Mark's help, they arranged a meeting with Sandra, the investigative reporter. She was a no-nonsense woman in her 40s, with sharp eyes and a reputation for taking on powerful figures. When they showed her the documents, her expression turned grim. "This is explosive," Sandra said, flipping through the papers. "But it's not enough. We need something concrete, a witness, a confession, Anything that ties Kane directly to your daughter's death. What about the warehouse, he asked. The one in the photos. If they're moving bodies, that's where they're doing it. Sandra nodded. It's a start, but we'll need proof. If we're going to take down Kane, we can't afford any mistakes. That night, they drove to the warehouse. The building was surrounded by a tall fence, with security cameras mounted on every corner. They parked a safe distance away and watched as a van pulled up to the gate. Two men got out, unlocked the gate, and drove inside. This is it, Mark whispered. If we can get in there, we might find what we need. They waited until the van was out of sight, then made their move. Using wire cutters, they snipped a hole in the fence and slipped through. The warehouse was dark, but they could hear voices inside. They crept closer, staying in the shadows. Inside, the warehouse was filled with rows of coffins. Men in dark clothing moved between them, checking labels and loading them onto trucks. His heart raced as he realized what he was seeing. This was the operation. This was where they were moving the bodies. He pulled out his phone and began recording, his hands shaking. But then he saw something that made his blood run cold. In the corner of the room was a small white coffin. It was Princess's. He stepped forward, his grief and anger overwhelming him. But before he could get closer, a voice rang out. What the hell are you doing here? He turned to see one of the men staring at him, a gun in his hand. The others quickly surrounded them, their faces hard and unyielding. You shouldn't have come here, Oman, the man said, raising the gun. Now you're going to regret it. But before he could pull the trigger, the sound of sirens filled the air. The men froze, their eyes wide with panic. Sandra had called the police. Within minutes, the warehouse was swarming with officers. The men were arrested, and the coffins were opened, revealing the horrifying truth. Bodies that had been stolen, sold, and traded like commodities. As he stood there, watching the scene unfold, he felt a mix of relief and sorrow. Princess's coffin was opened, and inside he found something he never expected. A note, written in her handwriting. It was a message she had hidden before her death, a clue she had left for him. Daddy, I love you. Don't let them win. Tears streamed down his face as he held the note to his chest. He had done it. He had uncovered the truth and brought those responsible to justice. But the cost had been unimaginable. As the sun rose over the warehouse, he knew one thing for certain. Princess's memory would live on, not just in his heart, but in the fight for justice that her death had sparked.
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.